Selamat siang. Hampir 30 yang lalu saya sudah tinggal di Jawa Timur. Dan saya senang sekali hari ini karena saya sudah kembali ke Jakarta. And I wasn't feeling nervous until Stacy said that this was going up on the web. So I hope she's going to edit out all my mistakes before they show up on the web. Today I'm going to talk about promoting food security following the floods in Pakistan in 2010 and some insights from South Asia experience. This work has been done with Sohail Malik, a visiting IFPRI research fellow. I'll talk a little bit about the floods, give you a basic overview of what happened, and then what IFPRI did at that time is we pulled together lessons from other South Asia experience dealing with how governments had dealt with floods. I'll talk about market and trade policies, livelihood support programs, and welfare transfers, and some responses that the Pakistan government had to their earthquake several years earlier. And then we'll talk about what actually happened in Pakistan in response to these floods, and discuss some of the policies and then some of the concluding observations. And I hope then that this will spur the discussion today as we bring this forward to talk about how Indonesia deals with recovering from emergencies. So, Pakistan, you can see from the slide at the bottom there, on the bottom left, it's showing what Pakistan looked like from the satellite photos in July before the floods. One thing you'll notice that in general, Pakistan, most of the land is sort of a dark brown or light brown. Almost all the agriculture happens in the Indus River basin in the center of the country. And then you can see on the bottom right in August that the river has swelled a lot, and in some places then that meant that households and villages were underwater. So more than 18 million people were affected by this. Almost 1/10 of the population of Pakistan, almost 2,000 people died as a direct result of the floods. 50,000 square kilometers were inundated, about 2 million hectares of standing crops destroyed, 1.7 million homes and 10,000 schools damaged or destroyed. So a lot of devastation last August in Pakistan because of these floods. So we took a look at the experiences of other South Asian countries in dealing with floods and emergencies, and we talked a little bit about what happened in Bangladesh in 1998. And I was part of an IFPRI project there based in Dhaka. We were working with the Ministry of Food, and IFPRI had done some research both in terms of the markets and in terms of what happened to households. My IFPRI colleague Carlo Del Nino had led that. So what happened in 1998? Well, during the monsoon in Bangladesh, the floods covered much of the country. At their peak, half of the country was underwater. Half of the country. As you may know, Bangladesh is basically, almost all the country is a delta area. It's the Ganges River flows in there, and two other major rivers flow into Bangladesh. And the country lost 2 million tons of projected rice production because of this flood. And yet, they managed to avoid deaths from starvation after this flood. I just want to talk a little bit about two policies that were crucial for this. One was a liberalization on the trade, allowing private sector imports to come into the country and help replace some of that lost production. And so the government encouraged these private sector imports, and in response to the market incentives, hundreds of private sector traders imported an estimated 2.4 million tons of rice, two-thirds of it by truck, one-third of it by train from neighboring India. And if you can compare this 2 million tons to net distribution of government rice, which actually increased by only 0.2 million tons relative to their earlier plan. So the private sector trade that came in and supplemented supplies at this time was a major factor in replacing the lost production. But as you know, food security isn't just about availability of food, it's about access to food. And a lot of households, because of the floods, lost incomes. They lost some standing crops. They also lost the opportunity to work as laborers in the subsequent crop in some places. And so what was the major coping strategy of the households? Well, a key part of it was borrowing. And they borrowed from private lenders the equivalent of roughly 1 month of consumption. And we followed these households, and 15 months later, after the flood, most of these households were still holding on to that debt of the equivalent of 1 month of consumption. So 15 months after the flood, you could look around Bangladesh and you would not know that there had been a flood 15 months earlier, and you wouldn't know necessarily by looking at the household, but they were carrying around this hidden burden of a month's worth of consumption of debt. And that, if you aggregated it up, that was a significant amount of debt that these households were carrying at a national level. We also reviewed some of the lessons from the Asian Development Bank projects on recovery, and several things came out very clearly. One was that social protection has to be prioritized in a disaster response. And awareness raising is a very important component to ensure participation of the most vulnerable households.
Sorry, Dr. Dorosh, your time 3 minutes more.
3 minutes, okay. I'm going to go really fast. You need participation of key stakeholders, you need to target to specific needs of different groups, and you need to enhance livelihood opportunities. Likewise, we looked at the Pakistan earthquake recovery, and one of the things that seemed very important was that they had a big program run by the government, but they didn't involve the communities as much as they should have in the design. So what happened in Pakistan after the flood? Well, part of the good news is that the flood didn't affect wheat production, their major crop. Their major crop, wheat, is planted generally in November, so that was after the flood. And the country had very high stocks of wheat at the time. In fact, the stocks were a little bit perhaps too high. You can see the upper red bar. The stocks were at 11 million tons. By historical standards, that was almost 6 million tons more than what they usually had carried. They actually lost some stocks at the time. Bottom line, though, was market prices were stable following the flood. Instead, the government announced an emergency relief plan. Initially, it was for $500 million. Later, they had an appeal for 4 times that amount. And in some sense, there was a lot of activity that addressed the needs of these flood-affected households, a lot of food assistance. A big part of their response was through a compensation program paid to flood-affected households. And they gave a one-time payment of approximately 20,000 rupees, which is approximately $233 per household, to 1.5 million households. And they did this through debit cards. And they had to conduct a survey first to register people and so forth. And now they have plans to extend that, to go through a second phase, and actually look also at housing damage as an indicator of who should be targeted. However, 7 months after the flood, there are still areas that are covered. Not very much of the country is covered anymore. And there are still 84,000 people, 3% of the original total, still living in camps. And 75% of these camps are in Sindh in the south. And so many people are still continuing to depend on emergency shelter. And if you can get a sense, if you look at the upper right, the box, the red box area, that shows the part where there's actually still flooding. Much smaller area than originally. So, a few summary points. We saw from Bangladesh that promoting competitive private trade can be an effective way to stabilize food supply and prices. And I think one of the key things from Bangladesh is that the private sector trade can occur simultaneously with government transfer programs and public stocks. It's not an either-or situation. And this private trade or international trade provides a safety valve in terms of ensuring supply. If the world prices are high, it might mean then that there would have to be some sort of government intervention on that import side. But it does in general provide an option for supply. Another key issue was the provision of rural credit or some kind of transfers. And we saw in Bangladesh that there's a major coping strategy for households after emergencies is often borrowing. And if we can come in with sufficient transfers, we can make a big difference to those households. That was a major part of what Pakistan was doing in the last several months. The story isn't all that good in Pakistan, though. I mean, there were major delays in funding and implementation. This relates to some extent to the weak, unstable economic and political conditions. There's been a lot of political turmoil in Pakistan in recent months. And it has been difficult to have a coordinated effort, especially linking federal and provincial governments. And so now IFPRI is working with Pakistani national institutions, and we plan an evaluation of the targeting of these interventions and other aspects of the program effectiveness. Terima kasih.